Welcome to You First, the Disability Rights Florida podcast.
I'm Keith Cassabon, and welcome back to You First. This is the second half of our 2019 Legislative Roundup podcast. If you have not listened to part one yet, you really should in order to learn about some legislation that, for better or worse, passed in the Florida legislature, as well as some great insight about the plastic straw ban controversy. And now, here is part two.
But another piece of legislation that didn't pass this year that we've been hopeful for many years now would pass were Senate Bill 62 and House Bill 349. These were bills related to the restraint and seclusion of students with disabilities in public schools. So last session, both the House and Senate unanimously passed non-identical legislation that they failed to match up in week 9 of the session. So the whole idea just sort of died out.
Oh, okay.
This year, the House unanimously passed legislation, but the bill in the Senate was a little stuck and stalled. And so why this is important, just so everyone knows, it was about 8 or 9 years ago, the legislature passed into state education laws some data collection and reporting requirements related to restraint and seclusion. And so everyone's aware when we talk about restraint, we're talking about devices or holds that restrict a student's freedom of movement. There's some restraints that are pretty, easy to envision, but there's ghastly uses of this authority to, do other things to students,
Sure.
Bungee cords. And, there's lots of grisly reporting out there as to how this actually takes shape. So for several years intervening since the legislature acknowledged that, there's an issue here and that we need to collect data on this. Because for the longest time, a lot of school districts were saying, nope, this isn't happening. We you might be hearing about this on the national level, but not in our county. So in the years since, we've advocated nonstop for much needed definitions, standards, prohibitions in this world. Because if you really read what's in Chapter 1003 at the moment regarding this, there aren't even definitions for what restraint is or any related prohibitions for what can't be used or standards for how they should be used. Yeah. So this is, without a doubt, very important material that no doubt can harm students if not implemented as a part of a larger understanding for trauma-informed principles and, what really happens when you restrain or seclude, leave a student in a room untended or unguarded or with the door closed, students with disabilities. So, like I said, this legislation didn't pass this session. We're hopeful that it will be reintroduced next session and we will continue advocating for common sense standards. There's some traction federally on this. There's some legislation in Congress to kind of mandate that states collect data different ways or do reporting or blanket prohibitions on some of these tactics. The U.S. Government Accountability Office recently issued a report outlining the unsatisfactory ways in which some states and portions of states report on these incidents. Since our own data collection standards have been on the books in Florida, we've seen numbers that close to 80,000 restraint incidents have occurred on students with disabilities since 2011, something close to 21,000 seclusion incidents. And if those figures are both underreported, hopefully that kind of illuminates the magnitude and the gravity of the situation at hand.
Yeah,
so
let's hope so.
So we'll continue to advocate for those provisions and those responses.
Yeah, so we also had, this was kind of the year of the alerts. We have alerts of multiple colors. So we had the orange alert and the camo alert, both of which did not pass through advocacy through the populations that they were targeted towards. And we understand.
Is this something like an amber or silver alert? Or, okay.
And we understand the intent of the bills, and they were put forth with good intention, that they were meant to kind of protect vulnerable populations. However, there were some significant concerns regarding them and regarding autonomy and dignity and privacy concerns. So the camo alert was meant to establish an alert system for veterans, and the veterans had the same concerns that we raised regarding the Orange Alert, which was targeted towards persons with disabilities. And we just felt that there weren't enough protections regarding autonomy and dignity and privacy. We did work with the bill sponsors to get some of that language put in, to put some privacy protections in. But a person with a disability does have autonomy to kind of go and do the things that they want to do without kind of having that overprotection of, someone just reporting them missing without having, the grounds or the standing to do so just because. So we really wanted a process for law enforcement to have to follow before they could issue that alert and, plaster someone's face all over the place saying this person is missing. And just by the nature of issuing this Orange Alert that is targeting a person with a disability, you're kind of outing that person as having a disability. And there is kind of that disclosure aspect to it as well. These are things that we do expect to pop up again. And we want to make sure that we are working with the bill sponsors and, with the legislature to make sure that we are implementing them correctly, because it's not that there isn't a need for something like that. Having a disability myself, if Olivia Babbis is missing and, I'm gone, but my chair is still here and my car is there, I hope somebody is looking for me, but I hope that, they are first checking with the correct people and implementing this correctly before instantly calling police and, plastering my face all over the news and identifying me as a person with a disability.
Exactly.
So we just make sure that those correct privacy language is implemented correctly and that we do have the process for law enforcement to make the correct, proper steps before, implementing these things.
Interesting.
So like Olivia said, we fully expect to see some of this legislation reintroduced in subsequent sessions, including in 2020. One final bill that didn't pass, that actually didn't even receive a committee hearing, that we know will be reintroduced in subsequent sessions, was House Bill 743 and Senate Bill 940. This was legislation titled Crimes Evidencing Prejudice. So Disability Rights Florida is a member of the Florida Hate Crime Coalition. And this is legislation that would be revising the state's hate crimes laws in a couple important regards. The disability specific portion of that is to modernize and update the definition of disability in these hate crime laws so that it's as fully expansive and in line with the Americans with Disabilities Act definition of disabilities as it's intended to be federally. So this didn't pass this session. There's a very vibrant and active coalition pushing for this. And this is very likely the type of legislation that might not pass until a different political moment in our state's legislative process, but one that we believe is important to message around and let people know, kind of what's at stake in these statute books in different regards.
Indeed.
So transitioning from legislation that didn't pass into some of what appears in the state's budget, which honestly could, deserves 2 or 3 of its own podcasts to really,
I can imagine,
to drill into. But some of the items we wanted to talk about included what happened with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. As many listeners, I'm sure, know, the state has an accessible affordable housing crisis at the moment that was only exacerbated given our recent hurricane predicaments, including in the Panhandle last year with Hurricane Michael. So in the past, the legislature has regularly swept money out of a trust fund that was established in the early 2000s to try to grow and secure affordable housing expansion in the state. The legislature's taken from this for many, many reasons in the past. And, in the last few sessions, you've seen much legislation introduced to try to cordon that off, to try to prevent legislative grabs into this pocket of money. And that was the case this year as well. However, given what happened in the Panhandle, given the effects of Hurricane Michael, if anyone was reading the tea leaves heading into session, even though the governor's budget included not raiding from this trust fund, it seemed as though very likely there was going to be some grab into this money. And that was the case this year. There was $137 million swept out of this trust fund, largely for Hurricane Michael related recovery and, planning
How big is the trust fund?
I believe that this trust fund annually has something in the order of more than $200 million, $240 million, $50 million. So, one way to conceive of this is that perhaps this is about half of the trust fund. And in some years, it's been completely swept. So, it's one of those frustrating things where if you're watching this and you're reading the news reporting of, the severity of our affordable housing crisis in the state, it's tough to know that the legislature's kind of grabbed from that fund, robbing Peter to pay Paul type scenario. And hopefully in the future, there'll be a process constructed that either A, keeps the legislature from sweeping out of this trust fund, or B, requires that the sweeps have to meet some threshold level of urgency or, supermajority votes or something. But we'll see how that all goes. Another area of the budget that we wanted to touch upon, because it actually directly relates to work we're doing at the moment, is in the Department of Corrections budget. So within the budget this year, there was a total of nearly $34 million and 585 full-time equivalent positions that were passed to address needed improvements to inmate physical and mental health accommodation processes. Our organization has recently been engaged in litigation with the Department of Corrections. So we're obviously very pleased to see that the department is acknowledging, and the state is acknowledging, that there's a need here, and that we've arrived at a moment in time where it's urgent to modernize how we conceive of accommodation processes for people with disabilities who are inmates within these institutions, within these facilities. So that's something we're very happy to see passed, and hopeful that the state will continue this discussion in the coming years. And we, of course, are doing our best to remain a part of that discussion.
And these budget updates, increases should be appropriate to make a real dent in this?
Well, so, that's tough to tell. We would certainly always say as a general concept that more money, more staff that are specifically directed to this issue are always a better thing. As to the sufficiency or adequacy of it, this is sort of the department's own calculation and the state's own calculation of what's needed now.
I see.
And whether this is the first year of a several year phase in of some of this funding and positions, we'll see.
It remains to be seen.
Right. But I'd be remiss if we were talking about corrections work without mentioning another thing that the legislature did right this year, which was passage of HB 49, House Bill 49, which was also recently signed by the governor. This is the Dignity for Incarcerated Women Act. So this bill, just real quick, it requires correctional facilities to make healthcare products available to each incarcerated woman, including those at county detention facilities, juvenile detention centers, or residential facilities, temporary holding centers, and any other criminal detention facility operated by the state. It also prohibits male correctional facility employees from conducting pat-down or body cavity searches on an incarcerated woman, requires that male correctional facility staff must announce their presence upon entering a housing unit for incarcerated women, and also specifies that male correctional staff may not enter specified areas of a facility in which an incarcerated woman may be in a state of undress or viewed as such. For people who don't live in this world, it's kind of jarring and shocking to the senses that some of these dynamics aren't already structured.
I'm surprised hearing it right now. Yeah.
Right. So we believe that there's a great more distance that legislation like this can go. And of course, we're living in 2019, and we know, given gender identities and other, influx discussions at the moment, it's difficult to categorize legislation geared toward incarcerating women as only affecting, female-bodied individuals and not transitioned individuals. And the same could apply to correctional facility staff as well.
Right.
So there's more to this discussion, and more to this discussion that naturally bleeds into disability-specific components as well. We're hopeful that the legislature is looking sincerely at these processes, at true criminal justice reform in the state and true institutional, correctional, structural reform in the state, and that there'll be an opportunity to revisit, concepts like this soon. But this was something the legislature got right for sure.
Excellent.
And I think at this point, Olivia and I wanted to share a little bit of our tipping of our cards in terms of what we think the run up to the 2020 legislative session will look like,
Okay,
and
excellent.
things we expect to appear on our radar very soon.
Good.
Sure. First and foremost, I think, is supported decision making. I think that will definitely be our top priority for 2020. A lot of states already have this, something that we're really kind of lagging behind on. We have guardianship, of course, in Florida. There's a lot of people that have guardianships that don't necessarily need that, but we don't really have that built into our state statutes, where we provide guidance to the courts on how to even implement that. So I think there's the possibility that the state guardianship laws will be opened up for reforms.
That would be excellent.
Absolutely.
And we have a previous podcast on supported decision making. So excellent.
Yeah, so I think that will be a possibility this year to kind of open that up for options that are less restrictive than guardianships, for people to really participate in that their own decision making processes.
Absolutely.
And we've had a internal working group kind of looking at the issue of supported decision making and trying to evaluate how some states and jurisdictions have moved this direction specifically, and some of the result of that movement. So some states have enshrined this concept in state law. We would be very hopeful that Florida would take a look at doing the same. That requires deep buy-in from people who are involved in this process: judges, courts, the legislature. People inside of guardianships, people who want less restrictive guardianships of their own. It's a very of the moment discussion, and one that we would like to be poised to help influence as the legislature presumably opens this law up. So
it's an exciting one to keep our eyes on for sure.
Yes, definitely.
Absolutely. And then emergency planning and management. We're seeing actually a lot of this already at the federal level. There was a law actually that just passed last week. It's a mouthful. Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness and Advancing Innovation Act, which actually just passed last week, which created a national advisory committee focused on disaster planning for people with disabilities, that has been tasked with reviewing federal policies and making recommendations to ensure that the needs of people with disabilities are properly factored into disaster planning. And there are actually a couple more federal bills that are in the works that are focused specifically on disability and the emergency management planning. So it's great that it's moving at the federal level, but we would like to see some of this at the state level as well. Sure. We had Irma come through. We've had Hurricane Michael, of course, come through. The disability population is at higher risk of death, of injury when it comes to disasters. And we've seen this, of course, in Florida. We've seen it in California with wildfires. So this is something that we definitely need to be looking at to protect the disability community, not being an afterthought, but making sure that we're a big part of the planning and what to do with the disability community, make sure that they're protected for getting them out when dealing with transportation and where people can go, for accessibility for shelters, making sure that home and community-based supports aren't lost in the middle of a hurricane or, whatever natural disaster happens to move through.
Wow. And I think that's the important piece. Like, rather than it being an afterthought, making it a forethought. We've seen in response to a lot of the recent calamities and disasters in the state and elsewhere, that our legislature's tendency is to legislate based on what just happened. If people died in a congregate setting or in a nursing home, or there was something that is headline grabbing, and correctly so. The legislature tends to hyper focus on that aspect of, how we plan and coordinate and manage through these terrible times. Obviously it's no surprise to anyone that, disasters affect all people, regardless of disability status. But like Olivia said, there's certainly very obvious aspects of disability that are unique in this planning, and that should be given forethought and pre-coordination, so that when a Category 5 storm is upon us, or has just cleaned us out, we're not scurrying to after the fact to try to put this all back together, piecemeal. So
we advocate to our clients to plan ahead. It would be nice if the legislature did the same thing.
Absolutely.
And I think there's also this misconception a lot of the times too, that we think of people primarily being in institutional care, and that's not necessarily the case. We're forgetting about the people that live in their own homes or in their own apartments that have home and community-based supports. And we found a lot of that in Irma, that those people were being abandoned and cut off from home and community-based supports and abandoned in their apartments for 3-4 days, being cut off from those services, not being provided transportation to shelters, didn't have the correct disability to qualify for special needs shelters, and they were just kind of stuck and abandoned there, and that was a huge problem within the communities as well.
And so in addition to expecting to see new restraint and seclusion legislation filed in the 2020 session, and we are hopeful that will happen, and that there's sponsors and members out there that will help galvanize, traction behind this issue and understanding behind this issue. The other elephant in the room, of course, is the second round of reporting from the Marjory Stoneman Douglas Public Safety Commission. So this year's reporting, which came out in January, you'll see that the commission, largely out of respect for the fact that the 2018 legislature in Senate Bill 7026 from that session passed broad revisions to mental health notions within state education laws, a lot of new processes, a lot of new ideas. On page 2 of the commission's reporting, they, basically explain that those new changes need time to take root and to flourish, and also to be understood and coordinated. We live in a state with 67 counties, which necessarily means there's at least 67 different interpretations and understandings of how this all adds up and what should be done in response. So it's important to not just pass these things as a patchwork solution one time and then kind of move on. It's important to recalibrate and revisit and to keep these discussions moving, and to keep ourselves connected to the discussions. So the commission has met this year, even after its first round of reporting, several times. It continues to meet. And its next round of reporting is expected out in January 2020, which will put it very close to week 2 of next year's legislative session. And as we saw with this year's public safety laws, we expect that the recommendations from this commission will be very highly regarded by the legislature and safeguarded as such. But of course, the discussion through the legislature's committee process will be robust, and we will be a part of that discussion. So folks who are interested in this work and in these evolutions and in how this stuff is changing should stay tuned. Stay tuned to what we're doing, and we'll try to make sure that others that are interested can get the best information so that they themselves can advocate as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for being guests today. This has been a very informative and enlightening discussion, and I hope our listeners really got a lot out of this as much as I did. So thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Definitely.
You can also get more information about the legislation we discussed today, as well as much more, at www.disabilityrightsflorida.org/legislation. Thank you to everyone for listening to the You First podcast or reading the transcript online. Please email any feedback about the show to podcast@disabilityrightsflorida.org.
You First podcast is produced by Disability Rights Florida, a not-for-profit corporation working to protect and advance the rights of Floridians with disabilities through advocacy and education. If you or a family member has a disability and feel that your rights have been violated in any way, please contact Disability Rights Florida. You can learn more about the services we provide, explore a vast array of resources on a variety of disability-related topics, and complete an online intake on our website at disabilityrightsflorida.org. You can also call us at 1-800-342-0823. Thank you for listening to You First, the Disability Rights Florida podcast.